What were you doing that made you want to go this route for your beat?
Honestly, I was really just fucking around in Logic Pro with a stock piano, and I just came up with that really simple chord progression. Because I was wanting a really loud beat, was really the only thing I was looking for, which can really go for anything. But I figured using less instruments would give me more room for processing like the main instruments more and get really loud and punchy. Like all I really got right here is I was messing around with the piano, came around with this preset, well this chord progression. But what's weird is like I actually decided like to come up with the 808 right under the piano, and that's where I got the idea from the rest of the beat, I guess. Because like once I came up with the 808 pattern, like I knew like instantly what type of beat I wanted this to be afterwards. So then, I just added obviously my kick and my hi-hat after that.
Do you always start out with a piano?
No. Usually I actually start out with a lot of the time I start out with just the beat itself. Like I'll start off with, let's say, example, I'll have usually everything but the piano. Usually I'll start off making a beat and it'll sound something like, and then usually I build a melody inside that. Sometimes I will just take the loop and build the 808 under it and then build the rest of the drums in. But a lot of time I just start with the drums, and that's how I usually start mixing too. Because I usually just start with the drums. Well, I start with the low end and the rest of the drums.
Is it true like mixing the drums is really important as far as bringing out?
Oh yeah, mixing drums is everything. If you like, especially with mixing hip hop, like you need big drums and you need a huge low end, and those two things alone like makes up like probably like 80% of like what makes a good mix in like modern music. It's like really good drums, really punchy low end, really consistent. That's pretty much it, really.
You ever use any guitars?
For the most part, not really.
Not
a lot of producers really use guitars, but I don't really use guitars that often. I'll use I mean, it's not that I don't mess with guitars, it's just kind of a coincidence thing. I just don't happen to use them that often.
What about bells? Is there
always every like
are
not
bells
this
like
beat.
an extension of a piano or?
No, I use like those like Detroit like bells where like, but I use that in like pretty much everything. Like I used to only use it in Detroit beats, but I've started using it in trap beats, and like there's some beats where I have them more towards the front because I want the bells to be more important, and there's some beats where I still want the bells, I just tuck them way in the background because they aren't important. But most of my beats had bells. Like this beat I'm pulling up right here. Let's see. This beat's a non-Detroit beat. I still decided to use some bells. Let me just get to the drop real quick. You see, I still threw the bells in there, even though it's not even a Detroit beat.
It
I
goes
just always
with the
like
sub
putting it
too.
in. Yeah, it does. That's why I really wanted it. I wanted to match the sub, definitely.
That's cool. Yeah, it's really punchy.
Yeah, definitely.
So you mix every single instrument, right?
Yes, even instruments. Like, there's a common saying that like not everything needs to be mixed, but for me, it's like everything can sound better, so everything needs to be mixed. Really, like I have like a certain like I guess like I have like a certain like image in my head and mind. It's kind of like a mental picture of kind of like a target that I want to hit in regards to like I want all the instruments kind of falling in the same frequency range a little bit. Like I want I want every instrument to kind of be hitting the same. Like with the highs, I want like my high end to be really consistent all across the board. But I still like a lot of thickness and a heavy low end. Mid range is usually something like, in my opinion, a lot of engineers just overthink. You don't really need to mix the mid range that heavily. Usually mid range for me is mostly reductive, but I usually don't add any mid range for the most part. Usually compression alone like takes care of like making the mid range more evident when I do stuff. My style's more about heavy compression than I guess it is EQing. I do a lot of EQing, but it's very like subtle EQing on like every channel, and subtle compression, and a majority of like the mixing that I do, like a majority of the meat to my mixing is mostly on the buses, like my bus processing. Like I'll take all my instruments, I'll have them all in their little groups, and I'll just like process like heavily like each of those groups, and then blend those into one group and then master it.
It probably makes it easier mastering.
Oh yeah,
on
definitely.
the whole.
Because it consolidates it to the point where like as long as I make sure my individual groups are consistent, then drums are too loud compared to low end, just quickly tweak it. Don't have to adjust all these individual tracks, and then it also allows me to use like a lot of the same plugins on each of the buses, so it's almost like across the board they're getting like the same sound regarding their processing, so it just really glues it together. Because I really like one of the most important things about mixing these really gluing sounds together, definitely.
And it sounds like if you use compression more so than EQ, you're already focusing on the quality at the latest end, as far as,
definitely,
you know, like your beat would be ready to be able to be used for anything, not just for vocals.
definitely.
It stands on its own almost. Is that true? Can I say that?
Yeah, it really, because like the thing is like one thing about using compression like more than EQing is that like a lot of engineers really focus like way too much on EQing, and if you focus too much on EQ, it'll just make it sound like really processed and stuff. Because like EQ is not meant to change the sound, and like that's the biggest problem. Is like people use EQing to change the sound, but it's really just there to enhance what's already there. Like there's like a lot of engineers like where like you'll look after their sessions, like really big engineers, and like you'll see that on each of their channels they're like barely actually doing anything. Like most of the processing they're rather doing on their buses, but for the most part they really don't.
What's that do for like computer power as far as the processing?
The processing?
Yeah.
Oh well, honestly, bus processing, well, it can get kind of tricky because like there's some plugins like Apex Vintage Exciter where if you use it on just a channel strip and then like as an insert and then you send like a bunch of tracks to that, sometimes it'll really like start phasing, it'll like give it horrible issues. So I started using that plugin on its own track itself. My template is really CPU intensive, so like I'm not really like the best when it comes to not using a lot of CPU. Like I know how to not use a lot of CPU,
right.
but I'm just like I just like using a lot of processing, so just like that's probably always going to be a consequence of my template in pretty much any room that I work in. But I can usually work around it because I'll usually just make any of the auxes I'm not using inactive, because I usually have a ton of aux tracks, but like I'll use a lot of them, and then the ones I don't use I'll make them inactive, and I'll make any stray audio tracks inactive. I'll make sure the sample rate's good.
Yeah, that's a good skill to have, but at least you know you have everything available in the event that you have a computer that's able to process everything.
Yeah, definitely.
What are some tips that you would have for engineers when they're coming into a studio that they've never used before, as far as
don't trust the subs, like ever. It doesn't matter like which studio you go to. Like, do not trust the subs if it's your first time mixing in there. Like, don't rely on the subs to like show you like the quality of your mix, because that often like throws you off and has you make bad decisions. best to mix on like the smaller speakers. That's how you make sure it's balanced. That's how you make sure it's consistent. That's how you make sure it sounds quiet the same way it sounds loud. And personally, for me, like all of my mixing I do on small speakers, and I just switch to the subs when I want to play it back for the client, and I just want them to like hear it loud and stuff. But the subs, I also use the subs to check my low end just a little bit because if you're used to mixing in the same room a billion times, you're eventually going to know how that translates. So I will use the subs in here, like sometimes for mixing decisions, but it's only because I've just mixed in here so often that I can make up for like anything that I hear like frequency wise that might not be in tune with like what I'd hear in a different room.